What happens when a small African nation dares to stand up to one of the world's biggest powers? When Burkina Faso's young leader, Ibrahim, Traoré condemned Donald Trump's tariff policies, it did not just spark outrage in Washington, it shook the entire global stage. Is this the beginning of a new era where Africa refuses to bow to Western dominance? President Ibrahim Traoré's decision to openly condemn Donald Trump's tariff policies sent shockwaves across the world. What many leaders had whispered in private, he declared in public, directly labeling the trade measures as a modern form of colonialism. His words carried weight because they did not emerge from a vacuum. For decades, African nations have endured economic structures that consistently favor wealthier countries. Trade rules, financial systems, and tariff regimes have been designed in ways that protect the interests of the powerful while placing enormous burdens on developing nations. When Trump revived his America First agenda and announced sweeping tariffs on imports, it was not just an economic adjustment. It was a reminder of the imbalance that has long shaped global trade. For smaller economies like Burkina Faso, these policies struck directly at the heart of their survival. The shock did not come only from the content of Traoré's speech, but also from the courage behind it. Leaders of developing nations have often chosen caution when addressing the United States, fearing aid cuts, sanctions, or diplomatic isolation. Traoré did the opposite. By standing on an international stage and calling out the policy as unjust, he challenged a system that many in the global South have grown tired of, but rarely confront directly. His condemnation was not a personal attack on Trump alone. It was an indictment of a model that treats weaker economies as expendable, as if their resources can be taken without concern for the people who depend on them. This boldness marked a departure from the usual diplomatic language of compromise and negotiation. It was the voice of defiance that demanded recognition. Observers around the world recognized the significance of the moment. For African citizens, his words echoed long-held frustrations. Generations have watched their countries send raw materials abroad only to buy back finished goods at inflated prices. The tariff barriers introduced under Trump threatened to deepen that inequality, shutting African farmers and miners out of markets they had relied on for survival. When Traoré condemned the policy, he was not simply reacting to a single economic challenge. He was articulating a deeper demand for fairness and respect. His statement represented the desire of nations across the continent to move away from dependency and toward sovereignty. It was a symbolic act that carried practical consequences, signaling to the world that Africa would no longer accept silence in the face of exploitation. International media immediately picked up on the sharpness of his message. Some outlets described it as a historic turning point, comparing it to moments in the past when post-colonial leaders confronted imperial powers. Others framed it as a dangerous escalation, suggesting that Traoré was risking his nation's fragile economy by provoking the United States. Yet beyond these narratives, the speech achieved what few had done before. It forced global attention on the economic suffocation faced by countries like Burkina Faso. His words reminded policymakers in Washington, Brussels, and other capitals that their actions had consequences far beyond their borders. Tariffs may appear as technical trade measures, but in reality they translate into lost jobs, failing industries, and shrinking opportunities for millions of people in vulnerable economies. Traoré's condemnation also resonated in academic and activist circles. Economists critical of protectionist policies cited his stance as an example of leadership willing to speak truth to power. African youth movements, already mobilized against corruption and foreign interference, embraced his defiance as proof that change was possible. Social media platforms lit up with debates, hashtags, and campaigns supporting his stand. Across the global South, his words found an audience that had long waited for someone to articulate their frustrations in a way that could not be ignored. The shock, then, was not only global but generational. It was the sound of a young African leader refusing to bow to the weight of global dominance and daring to demand a seat at the table where rules are written. Donald Trump's America First tariff policies struck particularly hard at Burkina Faso's fragile economy. The West African nation depends heavily on the export of raw materials and agricultural products to generate foreign income. Cotton, gold, shea butter, and processed food items form the backbone of its trade, supporting both government revenues and millions of livelihoods. When steep tariffs were imposed on these goods entering the United States, the consequences were immediate and severe. Products that once had a steady market suddenly became overpriced and unattractive to American buyers. Contracts were canceled, shipments delayed, and warehouses filled with unsold goods. The ripple effects began to spread from farmers in rural villages to business owners in the capital, and from small-scale cooperatives to the central government itself. Cotton farmers felt the blow first. For years, cotton had been a reliable export commodity for Burkina Faso, providing work for thousands of families. The new tariffs pushed down prices and reduced demand, leaving farmers with piles of unsold harvests. Without buyers abroad, they were forced to sell locally at drastically lower prices, often not even covering their production costs. Gold, another crucial export, faced similar challenges. Although global markets value the metal, access to the American market had been a stabilizing factor. The new restrictions created uncertainty and weakened investor confidence. Small-scale miners, already working in difficult conditions, now faced declining incomes that made survival even harder. Shea butter, often called woman's gold, because it sustains thousands of female producers, was particularly vulnerable. Many women's cooperatives had worked for years to establish trade links with cosmetic and food industries abroad. Tariffs turned those hard-won partnerships into liabilities as international companies reduced orders to avoid paying higher costs. This setback not only damaged incomes, but also threatened the social progress achieved through women's economic empowerment in rural communities. The broader agricultural sector, including producers of grains and processed foods, also suffered from the sudden shift. Burkinabe farmers and small industries who had invested in scaling up production for export now found themselves stranded. For the Burkinabe government, the decline in export revenues was disastrous. Much of the national budget depends on foreign earnings to fund schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects. When these funds shrank, development programs slowed or stopped entirely. Road construction projects were delayed, health clinics ran short of supplies, and education budgets tightened. The sense of progress that had begun to emerge in recent years was suddenly under threat. The economy, already vulnerable, found itself squeezed by forces far beyond its control. The tariffs also sent shockwaves through the private sector. Local industries that relied on American demand were forced to downsize or shut down altogether. Workers lost jobs, and unemployment rates rose in both rural and urban areas. With less money circulating in the economy, small businesses that depended on consumer spending also began to suffer. Shops closed, markets grew quiet, and the atmosphere of economic uncertainty deepened. Families who once relied on steady export incomes had to make painful sacrifices, cutting back on education expenses, healthcare, and even daily meals. Beyond the economic data, the tariffs carried a psychological weight. Ordinary citizens felt punished by a global power for reasons they could not influence. Many questioned why policies made thousands of miles away should dictate whether their children could attend school or whether they could afford medical treatment. For them, Trump's tariffs were not abstract policies, but direct assaults on their livelihoods and dignity. The sense of injustice grew stronger as they realized that Burkina Faso had little power to change the situation. A small nation with limited bargaining strength was being forced to carry the heavy cost of a policy designed to protect jobs in another country. This vulnerability exposed the deeper imbalance of the global trading system. While the United States framed the tariffs as necessary for its own economic survival, Burkina Faso and nations like it bore the hidden costs. For a developing country still recovering from decades of colonial extraction and dependency, the new restrictions felt like a continuation of the same cycle. Resources and labor were undervalued, while powerful nations dictated the rules of the market. The people of Burkina Faso paid the price, not through political debates in Washington, but through empty pockets, lost opportunities, and weakened hopes for the future. Ibrahim Traoré's response to the tariff shock was not silence or surrender. Instead, he launched a determined counteroffensive aimed at protecting Burkina Faso's economic lifelines and asserting its right to sovereignty. Where many leaders might have chosen cautious diplomacy, he chose bold action. His first move was to directly retaliate by banning high tariff American imports. Goods such as industrial machinery, processed foods, and luxury consumer products were suddenly restricted from entering the Burkinabe market. The decision was symbolic as much as it was practical. It sent a message that Burkina Faso would not be treated as a passive victim of foreign policy, but as a nation ready to defend its interests, even against one of the world's largest economies. This measure was only the beginning. Traoré used the crisis as an opportunity to promote a deeper transformation. He called upon farmers, engineers, manufacturers, and entrepreneurs to rise to the challenge of replacing imported goods with domestic production. Ministries began coordinating closely with local industries to identify areas where substitution was possible. From agriculture to textiles to food processing, new initiatives were launched to stimulate homegrown solutions. The government introduced incentives such as tax breaks, subsidies, and grants to small businesses willing to expand production. Training programs were created to help young people learn technical skills needed for manufacturing and value addition. Factories that once struggled to compete with cheap imports now received government backing to increase output. For ordinary citizens, this push for local production was more than economic policy. It was a call to national pride. Farmers who had lost international contracts were encouraged to see themselves not as victims, but as builders of a new, self-reliant economy. Rural cooperatives received tools and resources to scale up processing of crops like millet, corn, and shea. Women's groups that once sold raw products to foreign buyers were now supported to produce finished goods for local and regional markets. The emphasis on producing and consuming Burkinabe goods turned survival into resistance and resistance into empowerment. Traoré understood that Burkina Faso could not face the global economic system alone. His masterstroke was the creation of the Sahel Economic Sovereignty Alliance, known as CESA. This regional bloc, quickly joined by Mali, Niger, Chad, and Guinea, was designed to resist external manipulation and pool economic strength. By forming an internal market, these countries hoped to reduce dependency on Western buyers and shield themselves from punitive policies. CESA was not only about economics, it was about unity, dignity, and collective security. For the first time in decades, several African nations were speaking with one voice about trade, resources, and self-determination. The alliance sparked momentum across the region. Leaders recognized that no single nation could withstand external pressures, but together they could create bargaining power. Joint projects were announced, including infrastructure development, agricultural cooperation, and shared energy initiatives. Regional trade fairs highlighted locally produced goods and encouraged cross-border commerce. Citizens began to see their neighbors not only as separate states, but as partners in a shared struggle for independence from external domination. The very idea of African solidarity, often spoken about but rarely practiced, was beginning to take real shape through CESA's efforts. Even as international criticism mounted, Traoré refused to retreat. He framed the counteroffensive not as hostility toward America, but as a defense of Burkina Faso's right to exist with dignity. He emphasized that sovereignty meant more than political independence. It required economic control, the ability to feed one's people, and the strength to decide one's own future. His words and actions resonated with millions who had grown tired of dependency on foreign aid and dictated trade rules. By confronting the tariffs head-on and turning crisis into an opportunity, Traoré transformed a moment of vulnerability into a movement for self-reliance and regional unity that began to inspire voices far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré knew that survival depended on forging new alliances. The tariffs imposed by the United States cut deeply into his country's economy, but he saw the crisis as an opening to reshape global partnerships. While the West attempted to isolate him, Traore quietly reached out to alternative powers across the global South. His government initiated talks with China, India, Brazil, and Russia, seeking to create a network of economic cooperation that could bypass Western restrictions altogether. These efforts were not carried out with loud declarations, but with careful diplomacy, trade missions, and direct negotiations that steadily built momentum. China responded quickly. Already invested in Africa through infrastructure and technology projects, Beijing saw an opportunity to strengthen ties with Burkina Faso. Agreements were signed for road construction, renewable energy installations, and agricultural modernization. Chinese companies offered to buy Burkinabe cotton and gold, ensuring markets remained open despite American tariffs. In return, Burkina Faso welcomed training programs, technical expertise, and financing that did not carry the same political conditions often demanded by Western institutions. For Traore, this partnership signaled that alternatives to Western dependency were not only possible but achievable. India also emerged as a key ally. With its growing appetite for raw materials and its own experience of resisting colonial economic models, India saw common ground in Burkina Faso's struggle. Bilateral deals were struck to support agricultural technology transfer and to open Indian markets to Burkinabe products. Fintech cooperation was also initiated, allowing Burkina Faso to modernize its payment systems and reduce reliance on Western-controlled banking channels. The partnership extended into education as well, with scholarships offered to Burkinabe students to study in Indian universities, building long-term ties between the two nations. In Brazil, Traore found another partner willing to defy Washington's economic pressure. Brazilian leaders openly declared support for Burkina Faso's right to economic self-determination, recalling their own history of confronting foreign interference. The trade delegations traveled to Ouagadougou, negotiating exchanges of agricultural goods and energy cooperation. For Burkinabe farmers and entrepreneurs, Brazil's involvement represented both a lifeline and a model of how global South solidarity could translate into tangible benefits. Russia added a strategic layer to these alliances. Its government extended offers of military cooperation, cybersecurity support, and infrastructure projects. State-owned energy firms signed agreements for mining operations and electricity generation. These deals not only provided Burkina Faso with new resources, but also signaled to the world that the country was no longer isolated. Russian advisors quietly assisted with border defense, while new financial mechanisms allowed trade to occur outside of US-dominated systems like WIFT. Each new partnership carried risks, but collectively they created a shield against Western tariffs and sanctions. Traore's ability to navigate these relationships demonstrated a diplomatic agility that surprised many observers. While Washington and European capitals denounced his policies as reckless, in much of Africa and the global South, he was seen as a visionary building a new path. His willingness to engage with multiple powers on equal terms stood in sharp contrast to the dependency model that had defined African economies for generations. The alliances were not simply about survival, they were about demonstrating that small nations could choose their partners, diversify their options, and escape the trap of being permanently tied to Western markets. For millions watching from across the developing world, the image of Burkina Faso shaking hands with China, India, Brazil, and Russia was proof that resistance could be matched with opportunity. The battle between Ibrahim Traoré and Donald Trump was not only about tariffs or trade flows. It quickly became a clash of narratives, each side shaping the story in ways that revealed deeper struggles over power and legitimacy. On one side, the United States portrayed Traore as a destabilizing figure, a radical who threatened global stability by defying established rules. On the other, millions of Africans and supporters across the global South saw him as a courageous leader who spoke truth to power and defended dignity where others remained silent. This contest of perception became as important as the economic measures themselves. Donald Trump used his familiar style of sharp rhetoric to brand Traore as a disruptor. In speeches and media appearances, he described Burkina Faso as a potential hub of anti-American activity, claiming that its policies endangered markets and undermined Western aid. American television networks amplified these statements, framing the story as one of a reckless African leader risking his country's future for the sake of political theater. Headlines painted Traore as a dangerous populist, someone willing to gamble with the fragile stability of the Sahel. Think tanks and trade lobbyists in Washington echoed this framing, publishing reports that warned of a new axis of resistance forming around Burkina Faso. Yet outside the Western media bubble, the story unfolded differently. In Africa, Traore's firm stance was hailed as an act of bravery rarely seen in modern geopolitics. Citizens who had grown wary of dependency on aid and dictated trade terms felt a renewed sense of pride. His speeches, often delivered with calm conviction, resonated not only in Burkina Faso but across the continent. He insisted that tariffs were not protective measures but weapons of economic domination, modern chains that kept African nations in a cycle of underdevelopment. For many Africans, these words captured frustrations that had long been silenced or ignored. Social movements, student groups, and civil society organizations echoed his message, spreading it through demonstrations, campaigns, and social media platforms. The contrast between the two narratives was striking. In the West, Traore was a destabilizer. In Africa, he was a liberator. The divergence highlighted the deeper tension between global powers seeking to maintain dominance and emerging voices demanding equity. The more Washington pushed its narrative of danger, the more ordinary Africans rallied around Traore as a symbol of defiance. This divergence was also visible in parts of the global South beyond Africa. In Latin America and Asia, commentators compared his resistance to their own histories of economic struggle. Activists in Brazil, India, and Indonesia shared his speeches, framing them as part of a broader fight against the inequalities of the global system. The power of narrative shaped daily life within Burkina Faso itself. While elites tied to foreign trade networks worried about isolation, the majority of citizens embraced the story of national resistance. Farmers began to see their crops not just as commodities, but as contributions to sovereignty. Workers in new factories viewed their labor as part of a patriotic mission. Religious leaders echoed his message, reminding congregations that independence required sacrifice. The struggle was not only material, but also psychological, turning hardship into pride and framing resistance as a duty. This battle of images and words extended to international institutions. At the United Nations and the World Trade Organization, Western diplomats worked to label Traore's actions as reckless, while his representatives countered by framing them as justice long overdue. Speeches became arenas where each side fought to define the meaning of the conflict. In the halls of global power, Burkina Faso's president forced delegates to confront uncomfortable questions about fairness, sovereignty, and the legitimacy of global trade rules. The result was a standoff in which perception carried as much weight as policy. Trump's labeling of Traore as a destabilizer found support among Western allies, but his narrative did not dominate the global stage as easily as expected. The resistance narrative spread faster, carried by grassroots movements and amplified through digital platforms. Images of Traore standing firm against the United States became symbols shared across continents, strengthening the idea that a new era of leadership was possible. In this sense, the struggle was no longer about tariffs alone, but about who had the power to define justice, stability, and leadership in the 21st century.